It was just a formal family gathering, but one detail revealed a horrifying truth. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in her office at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. on a cold January morning in 2025, carefully unwrapping a package that had arrived without warning 3 days earlier. As the museum's lead curator for 19th century social history, she received donations regularly, but this one had arrived with unusual circumstances. No return address, no accompanying letter, only a small note card tucked inside that read, "This photograph has been hidden in my family for 150 years. It's time the truth was known." The frame was heavy, ornate mahogany with intricate carvings typical of the 1870s. As Sarah lifted away the final layer of protective wrapping, the photograph itself came into view. A large format album in print, remarkably well preserved, mounted on thick cardboard backing. The image showed a formal interior scene. A spacious room with tall windows casting dramatic light across wooden floors, an ornate carpet in the center, and simple but elegant furniture arranged around the space. But it was the people in the photograph that immediately captured Sarah's attention. 10 figures were arranged in a striking composition that spoke of hierarchy and formality. 5 men stood in a line, all dressed in expensive dark suits with bow ties and patterned waistcoats. They appeared to range in age from perhaps late 20s to mid-50s, their postures rigid and formal in the manner required by the long exposure times of early photography. Their expressions were serious, almost stern, conveying authority and social standing. In front of them, positioned on the carpet in what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement, 5 women knelt. They wore plain, simple dresses in light colors, white or pale gray, with long sleeves and high neckline. Their hair was pulled back severely, and unlike the men whose faces showed clear individual features, the women's heads were bowed, their faces partially obscured as they looked downward. Their hands were positioned in their laps, folded or clasped in postures of submission. Sarah had examined thousands of historical photographs during her career, and she understood that Victorian-era photography often reflected the rigid social hierarchies of the time. Family portraits frequently positioned people according to age, gender, and status. But something about this image felt different, more deliberate, more uncomfortable. The contrast between the standing men and kneeling women seemed extreme even for the era, and the women's postures suggested not just formality, but something closer to subjugation. She turned the photograph over carefully. On the back, written in faded brown ink, was a brief inscription. The division, Whitfield Estate, Virginia, August 1870. The division. The phrase sent a chill through Sarah. She immediately thought of property division, inheritance settlements, the formal legal processes by which estates were distributed after death. But why would women be kneeling during such a proceeding? And why did this anonymous donor feel the photograph had been hidden, and that the truth needed to be known? Sarah set the photograph on her desk under her examination lamp and reached for her magnifying glass. She would need to study every detail of this image because her instincts, honed by years of historical research, told her that this photograph contained a story far more disturbing than a simple family gathering. Something about the division had been deliberately concealed for a century and a half, and someone had finally decided it was time for that secret to be revealed. Sarah spent the next several hours conducting a preliminary examination of the photograph, documenting every visible detail before moving to more advanced analysis. She photographed the image from multiple angles, noting the quality of the print, the style of the frame, and the condition of the mounting. Everything confirmed that this was an authentic photograph from the early 1870s, professionally produced by someone with significant skill. Using her magnifying glass, she began a systematic examination of each figure in the photograph, starting with the 5 men. The first man on the left appeared to be the oldest, perhaps in his early 50s, with graying hair and a full beard in the style popular during the period. His suit was exceptionally well tailored, and he wore a gold watch chain across his waistcoat, signs of considerable wealth. The second and third men appeared younger, perhaps in their 30s, with similar facial features that suggested they might be brothers. The fourth man was possibly the youngest, late 20s, clean-shaven with sharply defined features. The fifth man appeared to be in his 40s, distinguished-looking with a stern expression that bordered on contemptuous. Sarah noted that all 5 men shared certain characteristics beyond their formal attire. Their postures were nearly identical. Feet planted firmly, one hand resting on their hip or tucked into a pocket, the other hand hanging at their side or holding what appeared to be documents. They looked directly at the camera with expressions of confidence and authority. These were men accustomed to power, to being obeyed, to having their decisions respected without question. Then, Sarah turned her attention to the 5 women kneeling on the carpet before them. This examination proved more difficult because their faces were largely obscured by their bowed heads and the limitations of the photographic technology. But as she studied each figure carefully, disturbing details began to emerge. The first woman on the left appeared to be the oldest, perhaps in her late 30s or early 40s, based on the visible portions of her face and the gray streaks visible in her severely pulled back hair. Her dress, while clean and well-maintained, was made of rough, practical fabric, cotton or linen rather than the silk or fine wool the men wore. Her hands were folded in her lap, But Sarah noticed something odd about the positioning. The woman's wrists appeared to be held unnaturally close together, as if bound, though no obvious restraints were visible in the photograph. Moving to the second woman, Sarah observed she was younger, perhaps in her 20s. Her dress was similar in style to the first woman's, plain, practical, designed for work rather than display. But it was this woman's hands that caught Sarah's attention. Unlike the first woman whose hands were folded, this woman's hands were positioned strangely at her sides, and there appeared to be some kind of irregularity in the fabric of her dress near her wrists, a bulge or bunching that didn't match the otherwise smooth drape of the garment. Sarah's pulse quickened as she moved her magnifying glass to examine the third woman. This one appeared to be the youngest, possibly still in her teens. Her posture was slightly different from the others. Her shoulders were hunched forward, her head bowed even lower, and her entire bearing suggested not just submission but fear. And there, just visible at the edge of her sleeve where it met her wrist, Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. A dark line, too regular to be a shadow, that encircled the visible portion of her wrist like a band. Sarah immediately reached for her computer and began scanning the photograph at the highest resolution her equipment could manage. As the digital file loaded, she zoomed in on the third woman's wrist, enhancing the contrast and adjusting the brightness. The dark line became clearer. It was definitely not a shadow or an artifact of the photographic process. It appeared to be some kind of restraint, possibly metal, possibly leather, worn beneath the sleeve of the dress, but visible at the edge where fabric met skin. Sarah knew she needed more sophisticated analysis than her standard museum equipment could provide. She contacted Dr. James Park, a colleague at Georgetown University who specialized in forensic analysis of historical photographs. James had worked on several high-profile cases where digital enhancement had revealed details in old images that had been invisible to previous generations of researchers. When James arrived 2 days later with his portable laboratory setup, Sarah showed him the photograph and explained what she had observed. James studied the image carefully, his expression growing more serious as he examined the kneeling women. "I see what concerns you," he said quietly. "Now let me set up the full scanning suite. If there are restraints hidden under those sleeves, modern imaging technology should be able to reveal them." The scanning process took most of the afternoon. James used multiple techniques: high-resolution digital capture, infrared imaging that could sometimes see through certain fabrics, and advanced contrast enhancement that revealed subtle variations in tone and texture invisible to the naked eye. As each scan completed, James loaded the files into his analysis software and began the painstaking process of examining every detail. "Sarah, you need to see this," James said finally, his voice tight with emotion. He had been working for nearly 3 hours, and his screen now displayed a series of enhanced images that revealed details far beyond what the original photograph showed. Sarah moved to stand beside him, looking at the screen. James had isolated and enhanced the wrists and lower arms of all 5 women. What the enhancement revealed was deeply disturbing. All 5 women were wearing restraints. The restraints were hidden beneath the long sleeves of their dresses, but the enhanced imaging revealed the outlines clearly. They appeared to be metal, possibly iron shackles, that encircled each woman's wrists. The shackles were connected by short chains that allowed the women to position their hands in their laps or at their sides, but prevented them from raising their arms freely. "Look at this," James said, zooming in on the oldest woman's wrists. "You can see where the metal has worn against the fabric from the inside. These restraints have been worn for some time, long enough to create permanent wear patterns in the dress fabric. And see here?" He pointed to a slight discoloration visible on a small patch of exposed skin at one woman's wrist. "That's consistent with scarring or abrasion from prolonged wearing of metal restraints." Sarah felt physically ill as she looked at the images. "All 5 of them are shackled?" "All 5, James confirmed. He brought up another series of enhanced images. "But there's more. Look at their ankles." He had enhanced the lower portions of the women's dresses where they pooled on the carpet. Beneath the fabric, faint but unmistakable, were the outlines of additional restraints at the ankles. The women weren't just kneeling, they were shackled at both wrists and ankles, positioned on the carpet in front of the standing men like property being displayed. "The division," Sarah whispered, the inscription on the back of the photograph suddenly taking on a horrifying new meaning. "This isn't a family gathering, this is property distribution," James finished grimly. "These women are being divided among those 5 men. They're enslaved people, and this photograph documents the moment they were distributed as inheritance." Sarah's mind raced. The photograph was dated August 1870. 5 years after the Civil War ended, 5 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. How could this be happening in 1870? Unless... James, can you enhance the background? Specifically anything on the walls or furniture that might indicate location or identity? James nodded and began working on different sections of the photograph. After several minutes, he stopped and pointed to a section of wall visible near one of the windows. Enhanced imaging revealed what appeared to be a framed document hanging there, and with careful digital reconstruction, some of the text became legible. "It's a property deed," James said, reading the visible portions. "Whitfield, that matches the inscription on the back. And look at this. There's a date visible on the deed, 1868. Sarah immediately began researching the Whitfield family and their Virginia estate. What she discovered in the historical records painted a picture of a wealthy plantation family that had wielded considerable power in Virginia before, during, and after the Civil War. The Whitfield estate had been one of the largest in the region, encompassing over 3,000 acres and, before the war, holding more than 200 enslaved people. The patriarch, Thomas Whitfield, had died in 1869, leaving the estate to his 5 sons. The men Sarah now believed were the figures standing in the photograph. According to records, Thomas's will had been executed in August 1870, which matched the date on the photograph. The estate had been valued at an enormous sum for the time, including land, buildings, equipment, and what the probate documents referred to euphemistically as other assets and holdings. But Sarah's research revealed something even more disturbing. While the 13th Amendment had officially abolished slavery in 1865, the enforcement of that amendment in many parts of the South had been sporadic and ineffective during the early Reconstruction period. Many formerly enslaved people found themselves trapped in systems of debt peonage, convict leasing, and forced labor that were slavery in all but name. Virginia had been particularly resistant to implementing the full rights guaranteed to formerly enslaved people. Local laws, known as black codes, had been passed that severely restricted the freedom of black citizens, and many plantation owners had found ways to maintain control over their former enslaved workers through legal and illegal means. Sarah found records indicating that the Whitfield estate had been involved in several lawsuits in the late 1860s related to labor disputes. Former enslaved people who had worked on the plantation had attempted to leave and establish independent lives, but the Whitfields had used various legal mechanisms, claims of debt, accusations of contract violations, even criminal charges, to force them to remain on the estate. Most chillingly, Sarah discovered records of a complaint filed with the Freedmen's Bureau in 1869 by a group of women who claimed they were being held against their will on the Whitfield estate. The complaint alleged that Thomas Whitfield and his sons were continuing to hold them in conditions of slavery despite the legal abolition, using threats, violence, and legal manipulation to prevent them from leaving. The complaint had been filed just months before Thomas Whitfield's death. Sarah found the Freedmen's Bureau's response to the complaint in the archives. An investigator had been sent to the Whitfield estate in early 1870. His report stated that he had found no evidence of involuntary servitude and that the women in question were employed under legal labor contracts. The case had been closed without action. Reading between the lines of the bureaucratic language, Sarah understood what had likely happened. The Whitfields were wealthy, powerful, and well-connected. The Freedmen's Bureau investigator had either been intimidated, bribed, or simply chose to accept the Whitfields' version of events rather than challenge a prominent family. The women who had filed the complaint had remained trapped on the estate. And then, in August 1870, when Thomas Whitfield's estate was divided among his 5 sons, those women had been divided as well, distributed among the heirs as if they were still property despite the legal end of slavery. The photograph documented that division, capturing the moment when 5 women were assigned to 5 men, their shackles hidden beneath their clothing but their subjugation made clear by their forced kneeling position. Sarah sat back from her computer, feeling sick and angry. This photograph was evidence of a crime, a continuation of slavery after its legal abolition, documented in an image that had been hidden away for 150 years. The question now was, who were these women? What were their names, and what had happened to them after this photograph was taken? Sarah knew that identifying the 5 women would be extraordinarily difficult. Enslaved and formerly enslaved people were often inadequately documented in official records, their names misspelled or omitted entirely, their lives reduced to property listings or labor contracts, but she was determined to try. These women deserved to be remembered as individuals, not as anonymous victims. She began with the Freedmen's Bureau complaint from 1869. The document listed 5 names of women who had filed the complaint against the Whitfield estate. Rose, age approximately 40, Hannah, age approximately 25, Patience, age approximately 17, Ruth, age approximately 30, and Dinah, age approximately 28. The ages and number matched the women in the photograph. Sarah felt certain these were the same 5 women, photographed just over a year after filing their complaint, still trapped on the estate they had tried so desperately to escape. Sarah expanded her research, looking for any other mentions of these women in historical records. She found scattered references in Whitfield estate documents, plantation journals, and local records. Piece by piece, a picture of each woman's life began to emerge. Rose appeared to be the oldest of the 5. Records indicated she had been born into slavery on the Whitfield estate around 1830, making her approximately 40 years old at the time of the photograph. She had worked in the main house as a cook and domestic servant for most of her life. According to plantation records, she had given birth to 4 children between 1848 and 1862, but all 4 had been sold to other plantations before they reached age 10, a common and devastating practice that separated enslaved families to maximize profit and prevent emotional bonds that might lead to resistance. Hannah, the second woman, had been born around 1845, also on the Whitfield estate. She had worked primarily as a field hand in the tobacco crops that were the plantation's main source of wealth. An entry in a plantation journal from 1868 noted that Hannah had been disciplined for insolence, plantation code for any behavior that challenged white authority. The nature of the discipline wasn't specified, but Sarah had researched enough plantation records to know that such punishments were often brutal. Patience, the youngest at approximately 17 in 1870, had a particularly tragic story. She appeared in plantation birth records from 1853 as the daughter of a woman named Mary, but Mary's name disappeared from the records after 1854, suggesting she had either been sold away or had died. Patience had grown up on the estate without her mother, working as a domestic servant from childhood. An 1869 document indicated she had been assigned to the household of Master Robert Whitfield, the second of Thomas Whitfield's sons, after Thomas's death, which meant she had effectively been given to him as property despite the legal end of slavery. Ruth, approximately 30 years old, had not been born on the Whitfield estate. Records indicated she had been purchased by Thomas Whitfield in 1858 from a plantation in North Carolina. The sale document coldly listed her skills: fieldwork, cooking, washing, sewing. Ruth had been separated from whatever family she had in North Carolina and brought to Virginia, where she had worked for the Whitfields for over a decade. Dinah, around 28, appeared in records as having been acquired by the Whitfield estate in 1863, during the Civil War. The circumstances of her arrival weren't clear from the documents Sarah found, but she suspected Dinah might have been a refugee from another plantation that had been disrupted by the war, or possibly someone who had attempted to escape slavery during the chaos of the war years, only to be captured and forced into service at the Whitfield estate. As Sarah compiled these fragmentary details into profiles of the 5 women, she was struck by how the official records reduced them to labor value and property status. But between the lines, she could glimpse their humanity, their resistance, Hannah's insolence, their attempts to escape, the 1869 complaint, their survival despite unimaginable cruelty. Hoping to find more information about the circumstances surrounding the photograph, Sarah researched J. Morrison, the photographer whose embossed mark appeared on the image. She discovered that Morrison had been a prominent photographer in Richmond, Virginia during the 1860s and 1870s, known for his formal portraits of wealthy families. The Virginia Historical Society archives held a partial collection of Morrison's business record, including appointment books and correspondence. Sarah requested access to the records from 1870 and spent a day carefully reviewing the documents. She found the entry she was looking for in Morrison's appointment book for August 1870. Whitfield Estate, formal commission, division ceremony, August 14th. The brief notation confirmed that the photograph had been commissioned specifically to document the division of Thomas Whitfield's estate among his sons, but it was a letter Sarah found in Morrison's correspondence file that provided the most disturbing additional details. The letter, dated July 1870, was from Charles Whitfield, the eldest of Thomas's 5 sons, to Morrison, arranging for the photograph. "We require a formal portrait to document the division of our father's estate among his 5 sons," Charles had written. "The photograph should show the 5 of us in positions of authority and should include the 5 house servants who are being assigned to our respective households as part of the settlement. The servants should be positioned appropriately to show the proper hierarchy and their status as assets being divided. We want this portrait to serve as a permanent record of the division and as documentation of each son's rightful inheritance." Sarah felt rage building as she read the clinical, businesslike language describing human beings as assets to be divided and assigned. The letter made it crystal clear that the photograph had been deliberately composed to document the distribution of these 5 women as if they were furniture or livestock. Morrison's response, also preserved in the file, was brief and professional. He would be happy to accommodate the Whitfields' requirements and would arrange for the sitting at the estate at their convenience. There was no indication that Morrison had any moral qualms about participating in this documentation of what was effectively ongoing slavery. Sarah found one more document that added another layer of horror to the story. It was a contract, dated August 1870, between the 5 Whitfield sons. The contract formally divided their father's estate among them and specified which servants would be assigned to which son. The document named the 5 women, Rose, Hannah, Patience, Ruth, and Dinah, and specified the terms of their service. Each woman was bound to serve faithfully the Whitfield son to whom she was assigned for a period of not less than 20 years. The contract specified that the women would receive room and board, but no wages. They were forbidden from leaving the estate without permission, forbidden from marrying without consent, and required to perform any and all duties assigned by their respective masters. The contract included a clause that made Sarah's blood run cold. Should any servant attempt to leave before the completion of her service term, or should she prove disobedient or rebellious, she may be subject to correction and discipline as deemed appropriate by her assigned master, including, but not limited to, physical punishment, restriction of movement, and extension of service term. This wasn't employment. This was slavery, codified in a legal-seeming document 5 years after slavery had been abolished. The Whitfield sons had simply renamed slavery as service, created fake contracts that the women had almost certainly never voluntarily signed, and continued to hold them in bondage through a combination of legal manipulation, physical force, and the complicity of local authorities who chose not to challenge a powerful family. Sarah knew she needed to find out what had happened to these 5 women after the photograph was taken. Did they remain trapped on the Whitfield estates for the 20 years specified in that horrific contract? Did any of them escape? Were their voices ever heard? She began searching through later records, tracing each of the Whitfield sons, and looking for any mention of the 5 women. The research was painstaking, requiring her to examine census records, property documents, court files, and local newspapers from the 1870s and 1880s. The trail for Rose, the oldest woman, went cold almost immediately. Sarah found no further mention of her after 1870, which likely meant she had died sometime in the 1870s. Not uncommon, given the brutal conditions and the fact that she was already in her 40s, old by the standards of people who had endured a lifetime of forced labor. Hannah appeared in records sporadically. A notation in an 1875 court document mentioned Hannah, servant to William Whitfield, in connection with a minor legal matter. She appeared again in the 1880 census, still listed as living on what had become William Whitfield's property, her status given as domestic servant. By 1890, there was no further mention of her. But it was Patience's trail that led Sarah to the most significant discovery. Patience, the youngest of the 5 women, appeared in several documents throughout the 1870s and 1880s, always in connection with Robert Whitfield's household. Then, in 1887, Sarah found something remarkable, a complaint filed in circuit court by Patience herself. The complaint, written in careful but unpracticed handwriting, stated, "I, Patience, have been held against my will by Robert Whitfield for 17 years. I am not bound by any legal contract and wish to leave his household and establish my own life. I have been denied my freedom and my wages. I ask the court to declare me free to leave and to order Mr. Whitfield to pay me wages for my 17 years of service." Sarah's hands shook as she read the document. Patience had found the courage to challenge her situation in court, to formally assert her right to freedom despite the enormous risks such an action entailed. The court records showed that Robert Whitfield had responded with his own filing, producing the 1870 contract, and arguing that Patience was bound to complete her 20-year service term. The case had gone before a judge in November 1887. Sarah found the judge's ruling, and her heart sank. The judge had sided with Whitfield, stating that the contract appears to be legally binding, and there is no evidence of involuntary servitude. The complainant entered into this service agreement of her own free will and is obligated to fulfill its terms. The ruling was a travesty of justice. The judge had either been unable or unwilling to recognize that a contract forced upon a formerly enslaved woman through coercion and signed under duress was not a voluntary agreement. Patience's attempt to gain her freedom through legal means had failed, but Sarah found one more document that suggested Patience had not given up. In early 1888, Robert Whitfield filed a report with local authorities stating that his servant Patience had absconded from his property and that he sought her return. The report offered a $10 reward for information leading to her location. Sarah found no indication that Patience was ever found or returned. The trail went cold after Robert's report, which meant that Patience had likely succeeded in escaping and had managed to evade capture. She had disappeared into the network of black communities in Virginia or possibly fled to the north, finally achieving the freedom she had been denied for nearly 2 decades. Sarah knew that the story needed to be completed by finding descendants of these 5 women, people who could provide family memories, oral histories, and context that wouldn't appear in any official record. She reached out to genealogical societies, posted inquiries on ancestry websites, and contacted organizations dedicated to preserving African American family histories in Virginia. The response was slower than she had hoped, but eventually she received an email from a woman named Jennifer Washington, a 62-year-old librarian living in Philadelphia. Jennifer explained that her grandmother had told stories about an ancestor named Patience, who had been held in forced servitude on a Virginia plantation after the Civil War, and who had eventually escaped to freedom. "My grandmother said that Patience made it to Philadelphia in 1888, Jennifer wrote. She was taken in by a black church community there and eventually married and had children. She lived until 1920. My grandmother was her granddaughter and knew her personally. Patience told her grandchildren about her experiences, though she found it painful to speak of those years. She said she had been photographed once, forced to kneel before the men who held her captive, and that she had vowed that day that she would someday be free." Sarah arranged a video call with Jennifer, who shared what had been passed down through the family about Patience's life. After escaping the Whitfield estate in 1888, Patience had indeed made her way north, traveling at night and receiving help from networks of black families who assisted people fleeing oppressive situations in the South. In Philadelphia, she had found work as a seamstress, married a man named Samuel Washington, and had 3 children. Patience never went back to Virginia, Jennifer explained. She was too afraid that the Whitfields would try to reclaim her. She lived her entire life in Philadelphia, and by all accounts, she was determined to give her children opportunities she had been denied. All 3 of her children learned to read and write. Her son became a teacher, one daughter became a nurse, and the other daughter, my great-grandmother, became a business owner. Oh, Jennifer had preserved documents from Patience's life, including a brief memoir Patience had written late in her life, prompted by her grandchildren who wanted to understand her story. Sarah asked if she could see the memoir, and Jennifer scanned and sent it. Patience's memoir was written in simple but powerful language. She described her childhood on the Whitfield estate, the hope that had come with news of slavery's abolition, and the crushing disappointment when nothing really changed for her and the other women. She wrote about the photograph. They made us kneel before them while a photographer made our picture. We wore chains beneath our dresses, so we could not run. They wanted a picture to show that we belonged to them, that we were their property to divide as they wished. I vowed that day that I would not remain their property forever, no matter what papers they forced me to sign or what lies they told. Patience described her years of forced servitude, the brutality and degradation she endured, and her growing determination to escape. She had planned carefully, saving small amounts of money she occasionally received as tips when she was permitted to do work for people outside the Whitfield household. She had made contacts with free black communities in the area, and in January 1888, when Robert Whitfield was away on business, she had simply walked away and kept walking. I was 35 years old when I finally became truly free, Patience had written. I had spent my entire life until then under the control of others, first as an enslaved child, then as a supposedly contracted servant who was really just enslaved by a different name. When I finally walked away and no one came after me, when I realized I was really free, I wept for hours, but they were tears of joy. Sarah worked for 6 months to prepare a comprehensive exhibition around the Whitfield photograph. The exhibition, titled The Division: How Slavery Continued After Abolition, opened at the National Museum of American History in September of 2025 to enormous public and media attention. The centerpiece was the photograph itself, displayed alongside the enhanced images that revealed the shackles beneath the women's clothing. Panels throughout the gallery provided historical context about the failure of Reconstruction to fully enforce the 13th Amendment, the systems of forced labor that replaced legal slavery, and the specific story of the 5 women in the photograph. Sarah had worked with James Park to create a powerful multimedia presentation that used the forensic analysis to show visitors exactly what the enhancement technology had revealed. Visitors could see the original photograph and then watch as the digital analysis exposed the hidden restraints, making visible what had been deliberately concealed for 150 years. The exhibition included documents Sarah had found, the Freedmen's Bureau complaint, the fake contracts, Patience's court filing, and excerpts from her memoir. Each of the 5 women was given her own panel with whatever information Sarah had been able to gather about her life, ensuring they were remembered as individuals rather than anonymous victims. Jennifer Washington attended the opening, bringing with her several family members, all descendants of Patience. They stood together before the photograph, looking at their ancestor forced to kneel in chains, while around them, visitors learned about her courage and her eventual escape to freedom. The opening drew over 800 people, including historians, civil rights activists, descendants of other formerly enslaved people, and members of the press. National news outlets covered the exhibition extensively, with the photograph and its hidden details becoming a powerful symbol of both the horrors of slavery's continuation after abolition and the resilience of those who survived and resisted. Dr. Marcus Williams, a prominent historian of Reconstruction, spoke at the opening ceremony. This photograph is important evidence of a historical truth that has often been minimized or ignored, he said. The abolition of slavery in 1865 did not immediately free all enslaved people or end all systems of forced labor. For years, in some cases decades, after emancipation, black Americans in the South were held in conditions that were slavery in all but name. They were trapped by fake contracts, by debt peonage, by convict leasing, by violence and intimidation. This photograph documents that reality. It shows 5 women who were legally free but practically enslaved, held in bondage by men who refused to accept that human beings could not be property. Sarah spoke next, describing the research process and what had been revealed through modern technology. When I first saw this photograph, I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't identify exactly what. The enhancement technology allowed us to see what was hidden, the literal chains beneath the clothing. But the deeper research revealed the metaphorical chains as well, the legal manipulation, the corrupt officials, the complicit systems that allowed this to happen. These 5 women were trapped not just by metal shackles, but by a society that chose to look away from their suffering. Jennifer Washington was invited to speak about her ancestor Patience. Standing here, looking at this photograph of my great-great-grandmother forced to kneel in chains, I feel both profound sadness and profound pride, she said, her voice strong despite her tears. Sadness for what she endured, for the years of her life that were stolen from her. But pride because she survived. Pride because she found a way to escape. Pride because she built a life of freedom and dignity, and because she raised children and grandchildren who continued to fight for justice and equality. She refused to let her oppressors define her, and she refused to remain silent about what had been done to her. The exhibition remained open for 18 months and was visited by over 200,000 people. It sparked national conversations about the long history of forced labor in America, the failure of Reconstruction, and the importance of acknowledging uncomfortable historical truths. The photograph itself became iconic, reproduced in textbooks, used in documentaries, and referenced in discussions about systemic racism and its historical roots. But perhaps the most significant impact was more personal. Inspired by the exhibition and the publicity it generated, dozens of other families came forward with their own stories of ancestors who had been held in forced labor after emancipation. Some brought documents, photographs, and family oral histories that had been preserved for generations but never shared publicly. Others simply wanted to tell their ancestors' stories and ensure they were remembered. Sarah worked with several universities and historical societies to establish a database documenting cases of forced labor after 1865. The database became a resource for researchers, genealogists, and descendants seeking to understand this often overlooked aspect of American history. It also served as evidence in several legal cases where descendants sought recognition and reparations for forced labor their ancestors had endured. The Whitfield estate itself became a subject of intense scrutiny. The property, which had remained in the Whitfield family until the 1950s, was now owned by a historical preservation organization. In response to the revelations from Sarah's research, the organization announced plans to transform the estate into an educational site specifically focused on the continuation of slavery after abolition. "We cannot change what happened here," the organization's director stated, "but we can ensure that the truth is told, that the women who suffered here are remembered and honored, and that visitors understand the full, complex history of this place, not just the parts that are comfortable to acknowledge." The museum also established the 5 Women Memorial Fund, providing scholarships for descendants of formerly enslaved people and supporting research into African American history. Jennifer Washington and other descendants of the 5 women worked with the museum to ensure the fund honored the memory and embodied the values of their ancestors. 1 year after the exhibition opened, Sarah stood in the gallery on a quiet afternoon, watching a teacher guide a group of high school students through the display. The students stopped before the photograph, listening intently as their teacher explained what they were seeing. "Look at how the photographer composed this image," the teacher said. "The men standing, positioned above the women. The women kneeling, forced into positions of submission. This isn't just a photograph. It's a deliberate staging meant to reinforce hierarchy and demonstrate power. The men who commissioned this photograph wanted a permanent record showing that they controlled these women, that they could force them to kneel, that they could divide them up like property." One student raised her hand. "But the women weren't really property anymore, right? Slavery was over?" "Legally, yes," the teacher responded. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery 5 years before this photograph was taken. But as this image and the research that uncovered its secrets demonstrate, the legal end of slavery didn't immediately end all systems of forced labor. These 5 women were trapped by fake contracts, by local authorities who wouldn't help them, by a society that valued the power and wealth of white men over the freedom and humanity of black women. They were legally free, but practically enslaved. "What happened to them?" another student asked. The teacher pointed to the panel describing Patience's escape. "We know that at least one of them, Patience, the youngest, eventually escaped and built a life of freedom in Philadelphia. Her descendants are here today, living proof that she survived and persevered. For the others, the historical record is less complete. Some probably died while still trapped in forced servitude. But even for those whose later lives we can't trace, we honor their memory by telling their stories, by acknowledging what was done to them, and by refusing to accept comfortable myths about the past." Sarah watched the students examining the enhanced images showing the hidden shackles, saw them reading excerpts from Patience's memoir, observed their faces as they grappled with this difficult history. This was why the work mattered. Not just to document what had happened, but to ensure that new generations understood the full complexity of American history, including the parts that were deliberately hidden or systematically ignored. As the students moved to the next section of the exhibition, Sarah thought about the anonymous donor who had sent the photograph that started all of this. She had never learned who it was. The person had never come forward or made contact again. But she understood why someone might finally decide, after 150 years, that this photograph and its secrets needed to be revealed. The photograph had been created to demonstrate power, to document the division of human beings as if they were property, to serve as proof of white supremacy and black subjugation. But now, through Sarah's research and the voices of descendants like Jennifer Washington, it served a completely different purpose. It was evidence of a crime, testimony to suffering, proof of resilience, and ultimately a memorial to 5 women who had been denied their freedom but had never lost their humanity. Rose, Hannah, Patience, Ruth, and Dinah. Their names were known now, their stories were told. The photograph that had been meant to erase their individuality and reduce them to property had instead become the means by which they were remembered, honored, and understood. And though Sarah knew that no amount of historical research could undo the injustice they had suffered, she believed that telling their stories truthfully and completely was a form of justice, delayed by 150 years, but finally achieved.